With this in mind, I'd like to introduce the concept of differential diagnosis. In medicine, there may be more than one possible explanation for any given set of symptoms. For example, cough. Cough is a symptom, usually one of several, with which a patient presents. And while most likely representing some form of an upper respiratory tract infection, is it viral? Is it bacterial? Is it pneumonia? Or is it simply a cold? Is there an underlying condition that could predispose the patient to complications? On the other hand, is it possible that these symptoms represent reflux, GERD you might have heard of, so not even anything to do with the respiratory tract, or even the side effect of a medication that the person's taking? Nowadays, anyone can Google differential diagnosis of cough and come up with the percentages of likelihood of any given symptom representing one condition or another, like I did. I think this is how patients think that medicine is done. Dr. Google, I have patients come in many times with Dr. Google's diagnosis of their condition. But not back in the 80s when I trained. I see today's docs, they all have, how they carry this in their pocket, I don't know. How this $1,000 piece of equipment is walking around the hospital, everybody just seems to have one. And they are fonts of knowledge of the most obscure diagnoses. How practical this is, I don't know. Because only rarely is a single symptom present in isolation. For example, our patient with a cough. Is there accompanying fever and chills, nausea, vomiting? Is there a postnasal drip? Is there sputum production? You can see how quickly one would need multiple Google searches, all able to correlate and integrate the information from the others in order to rule in or rule out particular options for the single diagnosis of the patient's condition. And I don't know what medical education is like today, but in my day, we spent years honing our abilities to discern which details of the patient's history and physical were pertinent. Differential diagnosis is the task of finding the most persuasive explanation for all the findings and symptoms in a given patient. Wiki defines differential diagnosis as, quote, the process of weighing the probability of one disease versus that of others, possibly accounting for the patient's illness. So I ask, why does one's diagnosis matter? I'll answer my own question to start with, to say because it changes the treatment. The physician or provider's diagnosis, their judgment matters in how they recommend and implement treatment for the patient towards healing and restoration of health. You can't arrive at the correct treatment plan until you have the correct diagnosis. Applying these concepts to spiritual matters, now I'll ask you, how has God's judgment been defined by those adhering to penal substitution? On the website, among other things, one of the resources is biblical keywords, comparing definitions. Way back when, Tim and I'd started working on this, and Tim and the team have expanded upon it, and it's really a wonderful document because, once again, going back to the ways we have thought about it and trying to recreate new pathways in our brains. On this document, under the imposed law construct, Tim has judgment by God, or God's judgment, as being defined as legal finding and determination of imposed punishment for breaking of arbitrary rules. Does that sound familiar? Now, I'm going to ask, how would we, with this new perspective on things, how would we define God's judgment? Anybody feel more comfortable talking about that?
What I understand now is just to turn it away. He allows you to make your own decision.
So turning away, Dale?
For me, one of the most important texts of the Bible, when we think about judgment, is what Jesus said in John 3, and I believe it's verse 20. And he said, "This is the judgment." And he goes on to say, "But the dark hates the light." If we forget that, if we don't have that perspective on judgment, I think we miss everything.
Well, and I love this idea, the richness that our pasts bring, or our professions. In my world, I'm leaning towards the medical side of things. I love the concept of God's judgment being his diagnosis of things, the diagnosis of the condition of the heart, along with his therapeutic intervention to heal and to save, his pronouncement of the natural result of the condition of the heart and mind. And these three different facets based on how, of course, the judgment of God is being used. But God's judgment is not the only judgment discussed in Scripture. Isaiah 1:18, our class's motto, "Come, let us reason together." In Romans 3:4, God must be true, even though all human beings be liars. As the Scripture says, you must be shown to be right when you speak. You must win your case when you are being tried. Here the remedy describes it as, God, may you be proved right and true in the hearts and minds of your intelligent creatures when you present yourself openly for their judgment. We need to be judging. We need to be discerning. So I ask you, what about your differential diagnosis? What's your judgment of the available evidence? We are invited to weigh all the evidence in the case of God's trustworthiness, of his righteousness, all the various motivations ascribed to God in the stories revealed in the Bible, the ways in which he designed the universe to function, and the degree to which he manifests and abides with his own law of love. Your assessment of him, your diagnosis of his character, will define the way that you become. For we know we will become like that which we worship and admire. The way you treat others, and ultimately whether your heart has the law of love written upon it, and you love others more than self. Other-centered giving, service, and love results in the maturing and perfecting of character, the healing of the mind and body. In differential diagnosis, not all evidence is equal, not all diagnoses are equal, and in the spiritual realm the same. While each thoughtful person's diagnosis of God's character may deserve thoughtful consideration, one must ultimately arrive at a diagnosis of God, his character, his methods, and his judgments. Now turning to our study of Revelation and the awful plagues. I'd like to start with something that I shared one of the Sabbath School videos this quarter with a friend, and she said, if I could have heard what Tim said in the first 3 minutes when he reviewed these provisos, she's eternally indebted to hear that. And I'd like to review those for us today.